All right, welcome to another episode of Traveling Through History. We're really glad you're here this evening. We have a very special episode for you. This is an episode I've been doing research for and getting ready for a couple of weeks. And the reason that I took extra time is because this president we're going to be looking at this evening, Abraham Lincoln, our 16th president, was a special leader in our history. Really took over at a crossroads in our history, very similar to George Washington at the beginning of our country. We're at a crossroads 70 some years later when we were deciding what we wanted to be, whether we still wanted to be together, whether some states were going to break off and become their own country. And he really was the leader that we needed at the time. He came along at a time when the country was very divided over the slavery issue. And he showed leadership, and he really showed fortitude in keeping the Union together, making sure that the South couldn't break away, that the country needed to be together, it was stronger together, and it needed to be in a state that was emancipating the slaves going forward, and that the slaves would become free, become part of our society, and really become part of our future in all ways, and have truly the rights that they were given under the Constitution as free men and as all men being created equal. So tonight we're going to talk about Abraham Lincoln, his biography. We're going to go through two short videos and talk about those on the other side. We're also going to go through, as always in our program, the 25 interesting facts about Abraham Lincoln. There's some really great ones in there that I found that I think you'll be surprised about when you learn about. You might think you know a lot about Lincoln, but there's so much to know. And then finally, at the end of the program tonight, we're going to show you a 2-minute reading of the Gettysburg Address by Abraham Lincoln, which is the most famous speech in American history by far. It was only 275 words, so it was very short. He was able to deliver the address in about 3 to 4 minutes, so it was very short, but the impact that it had on the country at that time and still even today just reverberates through the history, and still impacts our nation in many ways as of today. So let's talk about who was Abraham Lincoln. He was the 16th president of the United States, serving from 1861 to 1865, and is regarded as one of America's greatest heroes due to his role in guiding the Union through the Civil War and working to emancipate enslaved people. His eloquent support of democracy and insistence that the Union was worth saving embodies the ideals of self-government that all nations strive to achieve even today. In 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed slaves across the Confederacy. Lincoln's rise from humble beginnings to achieving the highest office in the land was a remarkable story, and his death was equally notable. He was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth in 1865 at age 56, as the country was slowly beginning to reunify following the war. Essentially, the country was coming back together again, and this death very much caused more divisions that we didn't need. Lincoln's distinctively humane personality and incredible impact have endowed him with an enduring legacy for the ages. So looking at his early life, Abraham Lincoln was born February 12, 1809, to parents Thomas Lincoln and Nancy Hanks Lincoln in rural Hodgenville, Kentucky. And he was born in a one-room cabin. So you can imagine he couldn't have come from poorer and less notable beginnings. Thomas was a strong and determined pioneer who found a moderate level of prosperity and was well respected in the community. The couple had 2 other children other than Abraham. So Lincoln had an older sister, Sarah, and a younger brother, Thomas, who died in infancy. His death wasn't the only tragedy the family would have to endure. In 1817, the Lincolns were forced to move from young Abraham's Kentucky birthplace to Perry County, Indiana, due to a land dispute. So essentially, Thomas, his father, lost this land in a dispute and felt like he had to move his family out of the state. In Indiana, the family squatted on public land to scrap out a living in a crude shelter, hunting game and farming for their own food and scraping out every living that they could get. Lincoln's father was eventually able to buy some land for himself and establish them permanently in that area. So when Lincoln was 9 years old, his 34-year-old mother died of trematol, or more commonly known as milk sickness. So she had essentially drank bad milk and died of it. She died on October 5th, 1818. The event was devastating to the young boy, who grew up more alienated from his father over time. And he resented the hard work that was placed on him at an early age on a daily basis by his father. He really resented it. In December 1819, just over a year after his mother's death, Lincoln's father Thomas married Sarah Bush Johnston, a Kentucky widow with 3 children of her own. So all of a sudden he had his sister, and now he had 3 other stepchildren that he had in the house. She was a strong and affectionate woman with whom Lincoln quickly bonded. Although both his parents were very illiterate at the time, Thomas's new wife Sarah encouraged Lincoln to read and to learn to study. It was while growing up into manhood that Lincoln received his formal education, an estimated total of about 18 months total in his life, which essentially amounted to about a few days a week of schooling. Reading material was in short supply in the Indiana wilderness. Neighbors recalled Lincoln would walk for miles to borrow a book. He undoubtedly read the family Bible many, many times and other popular books at the time, such as Robinson Crusoe, Pilgrim's Progress, and Aesop's Fables. In March 1830, the family again migrated, this time to Macon County, Illinois. When his father moved the family again to Coles County, 22-year-old Lincoln decided to strike out on his own, making a living in manual labor on fields. Lincoln was 6'4" tall when he was 22. He was a very lanky gentleman, and he was muscular, physically strong. He spoke with a backwoods twang and walked with a very long, striding gait. He was known for his skill in wielding an axe, and early on made a living splitting wood for fire and rail fencing. And what's interesting is many years later, when he ran for different offices, Congress, president, he was known as the rail splitter. That was his reputation, that he had spent a lot of his life wielding an axe, which really was true. That's what he did in his younger years. So young Lincoln eventually migrated to the small community of New Salem, Illinois, where over a period of years, he worked as a shopkeeper, a postmaster, and eventually a general store owner. It was through working with the public that Lincoln acquired social skills and people skills and honed a storytelling talent that made him popular with locals. And you can imagine that this storytelling talent that he was able to acquire at that time really helped him later in politics, because essentially that's what politicians do. So not surprisingly, given his imposing frame, Lincoln was an excellent wrestler. Wrestler was kind of one of his sporting hobbies. He had only one recorded loss in 300 matches, so he was 299-1. His one loss was to a gentleman named Hank Thompson in 1832. And he did most of his wrestling over a span of 12 years, from 23 years old to 35 years old. A shopkeeper who employed Lincoln in New Salem, Illinois, reportedly arranged bouts for him in a way to promote the business. Lincoln notably beat a local champion named Jack Armstrong and became somewhat of a hero from it. And actually, the National Wrestling Hall of Fame has actually given Lincoln its Outstanding American Award in 1992. So he's actually in the Wrestling Hall of Fame. Kind of interesting fact. So when Black Hawk War broke out in 1832 between the United States and Native Americans, the volunteers in the area elected Lincoln to be their captain. He saw no combat during that time, except for many bloody struggles with mosquitoes, but was able to make several important political connections during this period. As he was starting his political career in the early 1830s, Lincoln decided to become a lawyer. He taught himself the law by reading William Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England. After being admitted to the bar in 1837, he moved to Springfield, Illinois, and began his practice in the John T. Stewart law firm. In 1844, 7 years later, Lincoln partnered with William Herndon in the practice of law. Although the two had different jurisprudence styles, they developed a close professional and personal relationship. Lincoln made a good living in his early years as a lawyer, but found that Springfield alone did not offer enough work. So to supplement his income, he followed the court as it made its rounds to different circuits in the state. On November 4th of 1842, Lincoln wed Mary Todd Lincoln, a high-spirited, well-educated woman from a distinguished Kentucky family. Although they were married until Lincoln's death, their relationship had a history of instability. When the couple became engaged in 1840, many of their friends and family couldn't understand Mary's attraction. At times, Lincoln questioned it himself. In 1841, the engagement was subtly broken off, most likely at Lincoln's initiative. He actually got cold feet, and he wrote several letters to friends at that time that he wasn't sure about it. Mary and Lincoln met later at a social function and eventually did get married after another courting period. The couple had 4 sons: Robert Todd, Edward Baker, William Wallace, and Thomas Tad Lincoln. But only Robert, the oldest one, survived to adulthood. So they had a lot of tragedy, losing 3 of their 4 sons to different illnesses and deaths. So before marrying Mary Todd, Lincoln was involved with other potential matches. Around 1837, he purportedly met and became romantically involved with Anne Rutledge. Before they had a chance to get engaged, a wave of typhoid fever came over New Salem, and Anne died at age 22. So you can see just so much tragedy in Lincoln's life, in every phase of his life. Her death was said to have left Lincoln severely depressed. However, several historians disagree on the extent of his relationship with Rutledge, but they do agree on his level of sorrow after she did pass away. So a year after her death, Lincoln courted Mary Owens. The two saw each other for several months. A marriage was considered, but in the time, Lincoln called it off. And then eventually, as we just discussed, he married Mary Todd. So those were his major romantic relationships. In 1834, Lincoln began his political career and was elected to the Illinois state legislature as a member of the Whig Party. More than a decade later, from 1847 to 1849, he served a single term in the U.S. House of Representatives. His foray into national politics seemed to be as unremarkable as it was brief. He was the lone Whig from Illinois, showing party loyalty but finding new political allies as he went. As a congressman, Lincoln used his term in office to speak out against the Mexican-American War, and he supported Zachary Taylor for president in 1848. His criticism of the war made him unpopular back home, and he decided not to run for a second term. Instead, he returned to Springfield to practice law. By the 1850s, the railroad industry was moving west, and Illinois found itself become a major hub for various companies. Lincoln served as a lobbyist for the Illinois Central Railroad as its company attorney. Success in several court cases brought other business clients to him as well, including banks, insurance companies, and manufacturing firms. Lincoln also worked in some criminal trials as well. In one case, a witness claimed that he could identify Lincoln's client who was accused of murder because of the intense light from the full moon. Lincoln referred to an almanac that proved that night in question had been too dark to witness anything clearly, and his client was acquitted. So you can see he was a brilliant lawyer. He's always finding new angles and ways to win for his clients. As a member of the Illinois state legislature, Lincoln supported the Whig politics of government, sponsored infrastructure, and protective tariffs. This political understanding led him to formulate his early views on slavery, not so much as a moral wrong, but as an impediment to economic development. In 1854, Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which repealed the Missouri Compromise, allowing individual states and territories to decide for themselves whether to allow slavery or not. The law provoked violent opposition in Kansas and Illinois, and it gave rise to today's Republican Party. And of course, Lincoln was the Republican Party's first president. This awakened Lincoln's political zeal and really his anger, and his views on slavery moved towards more of moral indignation rather than economic. So he became very morally tied to the issue. Lincoln joined the Republican Party in 1856. In 1857, the Supreme Court issued its controversial Dred Scott decision, declaring Black people were not citizens and had no inherent rights. Lincoln believed America's founders intended that all men were created with certain inalienable rights, and that they all were created equal. Lincoln decided to challenge sitting Senator Stephen Douglas for his seat. In his nomination acceptance speech, he criticized Douglas, the Supreme Court, and President James Buchanan for promoting slavery and declared, "A house divided cannot stand," one of his famous quotes. During Lincoln's 1858 U.S. Senate campaign against Douglas, he participated in 7 debates that held in different cities across Illinois. The two candidates didn't disappoint, giving stirring debates on issues such as states' rights and Western expansion, but the central issue, of course, was slavery. And these Lincoln-Douglas debates were world famous. They didn't just get notoriety around the United States, but they actually traveled quite a bit to Europe. They were very interested in these debates that were happening in the middle of the country. Newspapers intensely covered the debates, oftentimes with partisan commentary. In the end, the state legislature elected Douglas and not Lincoln, but the exposure vaulted Lincoln into national politics, and now he was famous. Everybody knew who he was. With his newly enhanced political profile in 1860, political operatives in Illinois organized a campaign to support Lincoln for the presidency. On May 18th, at the Republican National Convention in Chicago, Lincoln surpassed better-known candidates such as William Seward of New York, Salmon Chase of Ohio. Lincoln's nomination was due in part to his moderate views on slavery, his support for improving national infrastructure, and the protective tariff that he wanted. In the November 1860 general election, Lincoln faced his friend and rival Stephen Douglas again, this time beating him in a 4-way race that included John C. Breckinridge of the Northern Democrats and John Bell of the Constitution Party. Lincoln received not quite 40% of the popular vote, but carried 180 of the 303 electoral votes, thus winning the U.S. presidency. He grew his trademark beard after his election. So you can just imagine that trademark beard that he's known for now, he didn't actually wear until he became president. Following his election to the presidency in 1860, Lincoln selected a strong cabinet composed of many of his political rivals, including William Seward, Salmon P. Chase, Edward Bates, and Edward Stanton. Formed out of the adage, hold your friends close and your enemies closer, Lincoln's cabinet became one of the strongest assets that he had in his first term in office. He would need them as the clouds of war gathered over the nation the following year. Before Lincoln's inauguration in March 1861, 7 southern states had seceded from the Union already. And by April, the U.S. military installation Fort Sumter was under siege in the Charleston Harbor in South Carolina. In the early morning hours, 1861, the guns stationed to protect the harbor blazed towards the fort, signaling the start of the U.S. Civil War, America's costliest and bloodiest war of our history. The newly President Lincoln responded to the crisis wielding powers as no other president before him. He distributed $2 million from the Treasury for war material without an appropriation from Congress. He called for 75,000 volunteers into military service without a declaration of war, and he suspended writ of habeas corpus, allowing for the arrest and imprisonment of suspected Confederate state sympathizers without a warrant. So he really got aggressive, and he did a lot of things that, if you think about it today, really were unconstitutional and were very controversial at the time, but he felt like he had to get aggressive to win this war from the very beginning. Crushing the rebellion would be difficult under any circumstances, but the Civil War, after decades of white-hot partisan politics, was especially onerous. From all directions, Lincoln faced disparagement and defiance. He was often at odds with his generals, his cabinet, his party, and a majority of the American people. So he was just taking flack from everywhere the entire war. So what he was really famous for, on January 1st, 1863, Lincoln delivered his official Emancipation Proclamation, reshaping the cause of the Civil War from saving the Union to abolishing slavery. So he really kind of reshaped the war, and he reshaped the whole debate. The Union Army's first year and a half of battlefield defeats made it difficult to keep morale high and support strong for reunification of the nation. And the Army victory at Antietam on September 22nd, 1862, while by no means conclusive or decisive, gave him some hope. It gave Lincoln the confidence to officially change the goals of the war. On the same day, he issued a preliminary proclamation the slaves in states rebelling against the Union would be free as of January 1st. The Emancipation Proclamation stated that all individuals who are held as enslaved people in rebellious states henceforward shall be free. The action was more symbolic than effective because the North didn't control any states in rebellion, and the proclamation didn't apply to border states, Tennessee, or some Louisiana parishes. As a result, the Union Army shared the proclamation's mandate only after it had taken control of Confederate territory. In the far reaches of the western Texas, the day finally came on June 19th, 1865, more than 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation took place. For decades, many Black Americans have celebrated this anniversary, known as Juneteenth or Emancipation Day. And in 2021, it was made a national holiday. Still, the Emancipation Proclamation didn't have some immediate effect. It permitted Black Americans to serve in the Union Army for the first time, which contributed to the eventual Union victory. The historic declaration also paved the way for the passage of the 13th Amendment that ended legal slavery in the United States. Then on November 19th, 1863, Lincoln delivered what would become the most famous speech and one of the most important speeches in American history, the Gettysburg Address. Addressing a crowd of about 15,000 people, Lincoln delivered his 275-word speech at one of the bloodiest battlefields of the Civil War, the Gettysburg National Cemetery in Pennsylvania. The Civil War, Lincoln said, was the ultimate test of the preservation of the Union created in 1776. And the people who died at Gettysburg fought to uphold that cause that happened in 1776. Lincoln evoked the Declaration of Independence, saying that it was up to the living to ensure the government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. And this union was dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. A common interpretation was that the president was expanding the cause of civil war from simply reunifying the Union to also fighting for equality and abolishing slavery. Following Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, the war effort gradually improved for the North, though more through attrition than by brilliant military victories. By 1864, the Confederate armies had eluded major defeat, and Lincoln was convinced he'd be a one-term president. His nemesis, George B. McClellan, the former commander of the Army of the Potomac, challenged him for the presidency, but the contest wasn't even close. Lincoln received 55% of the popular vote and was reelected. On April 9th, 1865, Robert E. Lee, commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, surrendered his forces to Union General Ulysses S. Grant. The Civil War was, for all intents and purposes, over. Reconstruction had already begun even before this surrender. As early as 1863, in areas firmly under Union control, Lincoln favored a policy of quick reunification with minimum retribution against any Southerners, which I think was a fantastic policy by him. He really wanted to bring people back together. Don't punish them, but try to bring them back in the fold. He was confronted by a radical group of Republicans in Congress that wanted complete allegiance and repentance from former Confederates. Before a political debate had any chance to firmly develop, Lincoln was killed. He was assassinated on April 14th, 1865 by well-known actor and Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. Lincoln was taken to the Peterson House across the street and laid in a coma for 9 hours before dying the next morning. He was 56 years old. His death was mourned by millions of citizens in the North and South alike. So you can just see some of the interesting and amazing things that happened with this incredible man who led our country so admirably through such a tough period. In some ways, even tougher a period than we saw during the Revolution. He was trying to hold the country together, and it was a country that was going in many different directions. And he really was a remarkable leader and a remarkable president, and had ideas that in some ways we hadn't thought of before. And it was a way out of this mess that we were in. So anyway, that's a little bit about Lincoln. Let's go ahead and take a look at this quick video, and we'll come back and talk about it on the other side.
We know him as the face on Mount Rushmore, through the words of the Gettysburg Address, the famous bearded statue of the Lincoln Memorial, the great emancipator, the 16th President of the United States. But before Abraham Lincoln was an icon, he was a man. And before he was a president, he was a husband, a father, a young lawyer struggling to make ends meet. Here, a born frontiersman transformed himself into a statesman. Under his folksy veneer, a man of intelligence, ambition, and deep concern about equality. He had arrived in Springfield alone, with no money, not even a place to stay. Here he would find all the pieces of his life: a wife, 4 children, a profession as a lawyer. Here, a young man would become Abraham Lincoln. And when he left Springfield 24 years later, he was headed for the White House and the pages of history. The year was 1837, and a young Abraham Lincoln was riding towards his future. Lincoln had already tried many of the jobs the frontier could offer: carpenter, postmaster, soldier, and surveyor. Now he was hoping for a new start in Springfield, with a law license and unbound ambition. Like Lincoln, Springfield in the 1830s was just getting started. It was a town on the edge of the prairie, with a few brick buildings, no paved roads, and hogs roaming the streets. It was a cross-section of the country: 1,500 Northerners and Southerners, whites and blacks, and immigrants. Thanks in part to Lincoln's work in the Illinois legislature, Springfield had been voted the new capital of Illinois. Lincoln had helped to transform Springfield, and Springfield would in turn change him. On April the 15th, 1837, Lincoln rode into town with everything he owned in 2 saddlebags. His first stop was a general store run by Joshua Speed.
Well, hello.
Say, how much would the furniture for a single bedstead cost? Mattress and sheets.
$17.
Speed later said, "I thought that I had never seen so gloomy a face. The tone of his voice was so melancholy I felt for him." He suggested a way Lincoln could avoid the debt. He offered to share his room above the store.
That sounds good enough to me. How do I get there?
It's right that way.
It was the beginning of a lifelong friendship.
Well, Speed, I move.
The young Abraham Lincoln was off to a good beginning. John T. Stewart, one of the most successful lawyers in town, had offered him a job as a junior partner. Stewart hoped to win a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives, so Lincoln took over most of the legal business. It was a crash course in litigation. But Lincoln also loved politics. He was serving his second term in the state legislature as a representative of the Whig Party, making a name for himself as a forceful speaker. His low-key, easy-going, common-sense style appealed to many, and he soon found himself at the center of a growing group of friends. In the evenings, they would gather together to swap stories and talk politics at Speed's store.
Jones, we were out hunting the other day.
Jones.
Now, Jones was hunting.
But something was missing. Mary Todd was the daughter of a well-known Kentucky political family. She had come to Springfield to live with her sister Elizabeth. When Lincoln met Mary, he was captivated by her looks, her ambition, her sassy intelligence, and her understanding of raw political power. The year was 1839, and Abraham Lincoln was dumbstruck. Mary's sister said,
Lincoln would gaze on her as if irresistibly drawn by some superior power. He never scarcely said a word.
Elizabeth thought they were a terrible match. But Mary saw a spark there that her sister did not.
So, how you been?
Good. Looking forward to getting out of the house for a little while.
Me too.
And soon she and Lincoln were going out together, talking about marriage, until the day their engagement fell apart. Some said it was due to Elizabeth's disapproval. Some said Lincoln feared that without any savings, he would not be able to support his new wife the way her family had. Whatever the case, Lincoln fell into a depression. He remained in bed for days, cared for by his friend Speed. Lincoln wrote, "I am now the most miserable man living." But by the next year, Lincoln and Mary had started courting again.
I don't know what to say, but
And by the fall, he considered marriage again, even though he had a bad case of cold feet. He wrote Speed,
you have now been the husband of a lovely woman for nearly 8 months. Are you now, in feeling as well as judgment, glad you are married as you are?
And with this ring I thee wed.
Speed must have had the right answer, because a month later, on November the 4th, 1842, Abraham and Mary wed. Lincoln placed a ring on his wife's finger.
I now pronounce you man and wife.
Inside, he engraved, "Love is eternal." They started out living in a rooming house called the Globe Tavern. But the city was expanding in all directions, and so was the Lincoln clan. With the birth of their first son, Robert, they decided to move. Lincoln purchased a small cottage in 1844 from the preacher who had married them. Recently built at the corner of 8th and Jackson, it was a simple 1.5-story home. The cost, $1,500.
Oh, this is wonderful.
Yes.
But to provide for it and his growing family, including a new son, Edward, born in 1846, he would have to work in earnest. Lincoln set himself to his career with a passion. He wasn't just a lawyer. He was a circuit-riding attorney on the 8th Judicial Circuit. That meant that he traveled from town to town all through central Illinois, going from one case to the next. Lincoln would be gone for 3 months at a time, twice a year, leaving Mary alone for long periods to run the home and care for the boys. Meanwhile, Lincoln's career was taking off. He started his own law firm in Springfield. Juries liked Lincoln's down-home conversational style in the courtroom. He developed a gift for making words flow and a reputation for diligence and hard work. Lincoln's skills became evident as he appeared more and more before the Illinois Supreme Court. Leaders across the state began to notice this young lawyer.
Private property is
Combining politics with his legal business, Lincoln was starting to build alliances at courthouses across central Illinois. And it was just about to pay off. Lincoln's public speaking and the connections he had formed both at work and through his wife's family convinced him to run for a seat in the U.S. Congress. And when he won a solid victory and became a congressman, it was the biggest step of his young career. The young Lincoln was thrilled to head off to Washington. He brought his family with him. But they soon decided that Washington wasn't really a place for a young family. Abraham packed Mary and the boys back to stay with her parents in Kentucky and knuckled down to work. He voiced opposition to the Mexican War, but was soundly criticized for it. He proposed a bill to abolish slavery in Washington, D.C., and got nowhere. Missing his family, he wrote Mary and his sons heartfelt letters.
When you were here, I thought you hindered me in attending to business. But now, having nothing but business, it has grown exceedingly tasteless to me.
The strain of their separation was evident in Mary's letters as well.
How much I wish instead of writing we were together this evening. I feel very sad away from you. I must bid you good night.
Lincoln had pledged before the election that he would serve only one term. And so, in 1849, he found himself headed home, having had a lot less impact than he might have hoped. He seemed to lose all interest in running for other office and buried himself in his work. And then a tragedy hit the family. In 1850, their 3-year-old Eddie Lincoln came down with tuberculosis. He was a rambunctious toddler they all loved. But the disease hit him hard. For 52 days, he struggled and sweated and tried to survive. And on the 53rd day, he died.
Whose life here on earth was all too short.
The funeral service was held in the Lincoln home.
And that someday we shall join him.
Abraham and Mary were devastated.
Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil.
To fill the void in some small way, the Lincolns had another baby, their third son, William. Another son, Tad, would follow soon after. As the family grew, the work was pouring in. Lincoln became one of the most sought-after attorneys in the state, earning a very comfortable living for his family.
If convicted of thievery, he will be sent to the penitentiary. Gentlemen, what will happen to these children? I beg of you, for this man's family. I rest my case.
But it took the passage of a brand new bill, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, to pull him back into politics. All through these years, America had been slowly tearing itself apart over one of the most bitter issues of the time, slavery. To some, it was a sin. To others, it was a way of life. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 was one of several stopgaps to avoid national conflict. It allowed slavery to continue in the South and the northern territories to stay free, until the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 changed everything. The new act said that any territories that joined the Union could vote on whether to become free or slave states, no matter their location. At the same time, a more restrictive fugitive slave law that had been passed several years earlier allowed slave catchers to capture and sell even free blacks into slavery. Suddenly, everything was up for grabs. Lincoln was outraged.
Mary, Douglas has managed to get the Kansas-Nebraska Act passed.
So Nebraska now has the right to hold slaves?
All the way to Canada. This repeals the Missouri Compromise. This is reckless. It's an outrage.
The law, championed by Senator Stephen A. Douglas, allowed the people of the territories to decide the slavery issue themselves.
Popular sovereignty, whether they wanted slavery in their new state or not. Can I count on your support?
Lincoln felt that since new territories could choose to be slave states, it could tip the entire country toward slavery. Lincoln began traveling to give speeches, talking out against the new act.
For although volume after volume is written to prove slavery a very good thing, we never hear of a man who wishes to take the good of it by being a slave himself.
Soon Lincoln was running for office again. The year was 1854, and he set his sights on the U.S. Senate. Lincoln was a popular candidate, but back then the Senate was picked by the state legislature, not the voters.
Order! Order! A call for a vote. The vote for United States Senator.
Lincoln.
Lincoln.
Lincoln!
Lincoln. Lincoln.
Lincoln.
And while he had had enough votes to lead in the first round, he did not have enough votes to win a clear majority.
The only way to do this is to give them to him. Give our votes to Trumbull.
Mary watched with disappointment as Lincoln withdrew his name and allowed another candidate to win, for the greater good of opposing the Kansas-Nebraska Act. But for him, it was just the beginning. Over the next 3 years, Lincoln crisscrossed the region, speaking out against slavery. In 1858, he stepped up to formally oppose the man behind the act he hated so much, Senator Stephen A. Douglas himself. This time, Lincoln was running as a member of the rapidly growing new Republican Party. He came to the Illinois State House to deliver a warning.
Until a crisis shall have been reached and passed. A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided.
For the first time, Lincoln was stepping onto the national stage. And it was a series of debates with his longtime rival Douglas that would grab the nation's attention. 7 debates in 7 towns.
I hold that the Negro is not and ought never be a citizen of the United States. I hold that this government was made on the white basis, by white men, for white men, and their posterity forever.
The New York Evening Post declared, "The prairies are on fire."
I think the authors of that notable instrument intended to include all men, equal in certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. This they said, and this they meant.
Lincoln's Republican Party would beat Douglas's Democrats in the popular election by over 4,000 votes. But Lincoln would lose once again in the state legislature.
Order! Order! The votes have been counted. Mr. Douglas has retained his seat in the U.S. Senate.
But Lincoln would not give up. For the next 2 years, he traveled the country giving speeches. The cause of civil liberty must not be surrendered, he said, not at the end of 1 or even 100 defeats. If the debates with Douglas put Lincoln on the map, it was a speech at New York's Cooper Institute that would mark his arrival as a national figure.
If our sense of duty forbids this, then let us stand by our duty fearlessly and effectively. Let us not be slandered from that duty. Let us have faith that right makes might, and in that faith, let us dare to do our duty as we understand it.
It was a remarkable performance. He had taken a crowd skeptical of this frontier politician and turned them into cheering fans. Lincoln was not the first choice of many in the Republican Party, but thanks in part to the tireless efforts of many friends from Central Illinois working behind the scenes, he became the Republicans' nominee. A committee from the convention traveled to Springfield to read the formal notification of Lincoln's nomination in the parlor of his home.
This is such a great honor and most humbling.
Almost immediately, the campaign began in earnest. Lincoln became known as the rail splitter, an honest, hard-working man from the West. One part of his image came from an unexpected source. In October of 1860, Lincoln received a letter from an 11-year-old girl named Grace Biddell. She promised to get the men in her family to vote for Lincoln if he'd let his beard grow.
All the ladies like whiskers, and they would tease their husbands to vote for you, and then you would be president.
When Election Day rolled around, Lincoln waited on edge for the returns. He didn't hear till after midnight.
President-elect Lincoln, we've won New York.
This is wonderful, gentlemen. I know a little woman on 8th Street who would like to hear this. Thank you.
At 1:30 in the morning, Lincoln hurried home to tell his wife the news.
Mary! Mary! We are elected!
Oh, that's wonderful.
We're going to Washington!
Oh,
you should have stayed.
The celebrations began that night in Springfield. A native son had become the president. But there were not celebrations everywhere. With 4 candidates for president, Lincoln did not win the majority of the popular vote. And in some parts of the country, as the votes were being counted, he was subjected to negative portrayals in many newspapers. Just 6 weeks after his election, the first state would secede from the Union. Even as Lincoln was preparing at his home, working to formulate his new administration, the nation was falling apart around him. Lincoln was under extreme pressure to compromise with the South, to give in on the slave issue to save the Union. What should have been a period of celebration was a tense time, a time of uncertainty, as Lincoln held his ground. He wrote,
If we surrender, it is the end of us, and of the government.
The day before he left Springfield, Lincoln returned to his law office and told his partner Herndon, "Tell our clients that the election of a president makes no change in the firm of Lincoln and Herndon. When I come back, we'll go right on practicing law as if nothing had ever happened."
Mr. President.
The following morning, just before 8 a.m., a crowd of townspeople gathered at the Great Western Railroad station to see off their favorite son. In an emotional farewell, the president-elect paid tribute to the town which had shaped him, the one home his family had ever known.
My friends, no one not in my situation can appreciate my feeling of sadness at this parting. To this place and the kindness of these people, I owe everything. Here I have lived a quarter of a century and have passed from a young to an old man. Here my children have been born, and one is buried. I now leave, not knowing when or whether ever I may return, with a task before me greater than that which rested upon Washington. Let us confidently hope that all will yet be well. To his care commending you, as I trust in your prayers you will commend me, I bid you an affectionate farewell.
Lincoln was leaving his home of nearly 25 years to lead a divided country. He could not have known how much it would demand from him. But Lincoln would draw upon lessons he learned in Springfield. 4 years of bloody Civil War would test his strength, his determination, his ability to handle tragedy and keep on going, ultimately staying the course to guide the nation toward a new birth of freedom.
So you can see so many interesting tidbits coming out of that video and so many rich aspects of his life. The first thing is, as he rode into Springfield, Illinois on horseback, literally with the clothes on his back and 2 saddlebags, that's all he had to his name, comes upon a very nice shop owner who decides to put him up and essentially let him stay for free in a room with him and get him started in Springfield, Illinois. Coming from this very poor background that he came from, being born in a one-room cabin in Kentucky and then working the land, being a rail splitter, essentially being a laborer his entire life, and then coming into Springfield and blossoming the way he did, learning the law, becoming one of the best lawyers in Illinois, becoming a politician, representing the state of Illinois in the U.S. Congress, and then, of course, then making it all the way to the presidency. Really, we had not seen a rise like this in the United States to this kind of prominence since Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson and Lincoln had a lot of similarities, obviously both coming from poor backgrounds, both coming from Western states, not from the Eastern states that most of the presidents came from. Being a man of the people, being a populist, very much looked at by the people as one of them and their president, the common man's president. And so you can just see the amazing ride he had for those 25 years up to prominence and up to this kind of powerful position. At the same time, you can see what he was facing when he got to Washington. He was facing a country divided. He was facing southern states seceding on a monthly basis. He was facing a country that was about to be at war. And they were about to spend 4 years of bloody battles and giving up of treasure and blood for the cause, which was to keep the country together and to eradicate slavery. So he didn't really, on that train ride at the end of that video, know what he was about to face, but he had been equipped for it. He was strong. He was from the plains. He had had a rough upbringing. He had had a lot of tragedy in his life. Obviously, his mother died when he was 9 years old. He lost a younger brother. He lost 3 of his 4 sons to early deaths. And he had lots of other tragedies in his life. And he was able to overcome all of those, even though he did have bouts of depression throughout that. You saw a scene there where his roommate Speed was trying to buck him up because he was missing Mary at that time. But he was able to get through all of that and get to this very powerful position of president. And he was the right man for the job at the time. He was able to keep the country together through very trying times and pull the country back together after the war and find a way for us to get back to the union that we had always meant to be. So lots of really great stuff in that video, and hopefully you get a chance to dig into some more of his life and some more of these kind of bio videos. They're really fantastic about Lincoln. There's so much richness to his life, and there's so much to know about him. Let's go ahead and talk about the 25 interesting facts about Abraham Lincoln. Number one, at 6'4", Abraham Lincoln was our tallest president. Our 16th president, Abraham Lincoln, stood 6'4" tall and towered above all others at the time. You can see a picture there on the right of him with his men out on one of the Union battlefields, and he was almost a foot taller than everybody else. He was ungainly. He was a little stooped in the shoulders. His legs and arms were long, his feet and hands large. His forehead was high. His head was over average size. His eyes were gray. His face and forehead were wrinkled even in his youth, and they deepened with age. Generally, he was a very sad man who struggled with depression most of his life. But when he warmed up, all the sadness vanished. His face was radiant and glowing and almost gave expression to his thoughts before his tongue would utter them. And that was Joshua Speed, his roommate at the time when he first moved to Springfield. Mr. Lincoln was a very tall, thin figure with an intellectual face, showing a searching mind and a cool judgment. That was an article in Boston Daily Advertiser. Abraham Lincoln is a dark, complexioned man, a very tall figure, and so exceedingly well preserved that he would not have taken more than 38, though he was rising at 50 years of age, said the Cincinnati Daily Commercial. So you can see back then they really believed that he was well preserved and that he had taken good care of himself, and he really had great stature. Number two, Lincoln was the first president to be born outside the original 13 colonies. So we talked about Andrew Jackson earlier. Andrew Jackson was actually born in North Carolina, but settled down on the Western frontier, just like Lincoln had been born on the Western frontier. The first 11 presidents were born in the original 13 colonies of the United States, but Lincoln was born in a log cabin on the frontier state of Kentucky, and therefore was the first frontier president. Lincoln was the very shrewd politician over the course of his life and consistently used his very humble roots as his calling card so he could run as the man of the people. He was a populist very much in the same way Andrew Jackson was before him. You see some great pictures of him growing up on the farm, there with his father, there with his mother, and always had an axe in his hand. He was known as the rail splitter for much of his career. And you saw in the video, they talked a little bit about his humble roots and his Western roots and his real kind of folksy style and the way that he would talk to people and the way he could relate to everybody was a huge asset for him in politics as he made his rise. People just very much liked him as a person. Number three, Lincoln was the first president to be photographed at his inauguration. John Wilkes Booth, his assassin, can be seen standing close to Lincoln in the picture. You see there on the top left, Lincoln with his hand on the Bible taking the oath of office, and then down below, he's taking that same oath of office and he's about to give his speech. And then up in the balcony above with the circle around him, that's John Wilkes Booth. So how ironic was it that he was there at his inauguration? So he was the first president to be elected during the photograph age. And I read a lot of interesting research about Lincoln. He understood the power of the photograph. He knew that it was incredibly powerful, that the images that you could give off could be a lasting impression for people. So a lot of times in his elections and his different campaigns that he ran, he made sure there were photographers with him at all times, and he would take poses in different situations, making him look very presidential, making him look very strong, making him look like he was a man of history. And he understood the power of photos. And so he was the most photographed American up to that time. The famous photograph of the inaugural address had John Wilkes Booth in the picture up above. in that ironic twist of fate for both of them. The Civil War, which broke out shortly after he took office, was the first war that was photographed throughout, shocking all citizens with the brutal nature of the photos coming out of the battles. And if you've ever spent some time looking at some of those battle photographs, they really were hard to look at and really did shock the conscience of the entire country. Number 4, there are no direct descendants of Abraham Lincoln, even though he had 4 sons. Robert Todd Lincoln, who you see there on the left as a boy and then down below as a man, was the only one of the children who lived long enough to marry and have children of his own. He had a son who died at 16 and 2 daughters. So Robert Lincoln's great-grandson, Robert Todd Lincoln Beckworth, was the last surviving direct descendant of Abraham Lincoln. Beckworth's death was in 1985, and that extinguished the Abraham Lincoln bloodline. All of Lincoln's descendants are buried in Oak Ridge Cemetery in Springfield, Illinois, with one exception, his son Robert, who was buried in Arlington National Cemetery. Robert saw brief service in the Civil War, which qualified him to be buried there. It was Robert's wife who saw to it that he was buried in Arlington. Of course, she might have been acting on her husband's wishes. He had a testy relationship with his mother, Mary Todd Lincoln, and might have dreaded the thought of laying next to her for eternity. Number 5, during the Civil War, telegraph wires were strung to follow the action on the battlefield. There was no telegraph office in the White House, so Lincoln went across the street to the War Department to get the news. Nearly 150 years before the advent of text, tweets, and email, President Abraham Lincoln became the first wired president by embracing the original electronic messaging technology, the telegraph. The 16th president may be remembered for his soaring oratory that stirred the Union, but nearly 1,000 bite-sized telegrams that he wrote during his presidency helped win the Civil War by projecting presidential power in an unprecedented fashion. He also received most of his intelligence from the front by receiving telegraphs from his generals on a daily basis. You see a picture of him there writing one of his telegraphs that was to go out to the field. And then down below, a really fantastic book called Lincoln in the Telegraph Office. It talks all about the importance of the telegraph during the Civil War and how Lincoln used it to his advantage. Number 6, the contents of Lincoln's pockets that evening of his assassination by John Wilkes Booth were hidden until recently. The contents of Lincoln's pockets on the night of the assassination weren't revealed until February 12, 1976, so not too long ago. They contained 2 pairs of spectacles, a chamois lens cleaner, a ivory and silver pocket knife, a large white Irish linen handkerchief, slightly used, with A. Lincoln embroidered in red on it, a gold quartz watch fob without a watch, a new silk-lined leather wallet containing a pencil, a Confederate $5 bill, and news clippings of unrest in the Confederate Army, emancipation in Missouri, the Union Party platform of 1864, and an article on the presidency by John Bright. So you can see all of the items that were in his pockets, including the 2 sets of spectacles, were all there on the table. Number 7, Lincoln was the only president to receive a patent. On March 10, 1849, Abraham Lincoln filed a patent for a device for buoying vessels over shoals with U.S. Patent Office. Patent number 6469 was approved 2 months later, giving Abraham Lincoln the honor of being the only U.S. president to hold a patent. During his brief experience as a ferryman on the Mississippi River, Lincoln was stranded twice on riverboats that had run aground. His invention was adjustable buoyant air chambers would be attached to the sides of the boat, and they could be lowered into the water and inflated to lift the boat over obstructions in the water. Lincoln whittled the scale patent model while Walter Davis, a Springfield mechanic, provided tools and advice while he did it. And you can see the model there that Lincoln actually whittled in his lab when he was thinking about this device. And you see some pictures there from the actual patent that was filed and that he was granted. It's a pretty cool device that he came up with there to help boats get around the Mississippi when they got stranded. Number 8, Lincoln's son Robert had a terrible legacy with assassinations. Robert Todd Lincoln has the unfortunate legacy of being present or nearby when 3 presidential assassinations occurred. He was at the White House during his father's assassination at Ford's Theater and rushed to his parents' side upon hearing the news. He was an eyewitness to President James Garfield's assassination in 1881, and he was outside the building in Buffalo, New York, where President William McKinley was shot in 1901. Recognizing this trend, Robert Lincoln is said to have refused a later presidential invitation with the response, "No, I'm not going, and they'd better not ask me because there's a certain fatality about presidential functions when I am present." So you can imagine how snakebit he must have felt about these three assassinations that he was witness to. First one at the top left up there was his father being shot by John Wilkes Booth. The middle one there, of course, was 1881, James Garfield's assassination. And then on the very bottom was when McKinley got shot in 1901. Number 9, Mary Todd Lincoln held seances at the White House along with Abraham. It's a picture of Mary Todd Lincoln there, and then she would hold the seances in the Red Room. There's a picture of the Red Room there. Lincoln and his wife held seances in the White House. They had great interest in psychic phenomena. Mary found several psychics she liked and held seances in the White House's Red Room, as many as 8 times while serving as First Lady. Some of these seances were attended by her husband as an active participant. Throughout her life, Mary suffered an immense amount of loss, including her mother at a young age, 3 out of 4 of her children, and the brutal assassination of her husband before her very eyes. She first turned to spiritualism as a tool for processing her grief after the death of her second youngest son, William, or Willie, in February 1862. She and Abraham also turned to spiritualism to get through the most brutal war in our country's history, American Civil War. Psychic arts had become very popular in the United States in the mid-1800s as a way to reach out to the spirits of loved ones who had passed. It's very interesting that they used to hold these seances in the White House and try to cope with the grief that both of them had felt throughout their lives. Number 10, Lincoln was the first president with a beard, and he grew it after receiving a letter from a young fan. You heard a little bit about this in the video. A few weeks before he was elected president, Lincoln received a letter from Grace Bedell, an 11-year-old girl from Westfield, New York, who urged him to grow a beard to get him elected. In Lincoln's response of October 19th, he gave no promises to Grace, but a month later allowed his beard to grow. Grace thought the beard would ingratiate him with men around the country, and women would think he was handsome. See a picture of them here on the bottom left, where he looked most of his life without a beard. And then after the presidency, you see here, grow the beard. And then there's a picture of Grace when she was much older. That's when she was 23 years old, but she wrote the letter on the very bottom right there when she was 11 years old to Abraham Lincoln. And of course, he responded to it. Number 11, Abraham Lincoln was truly a rags to riches story. Lincoln was born on February 12, 1809 to Nancy and Thomas Lincoln in a one-room log cabin in Hardin County, Kentucky. And you see the log cabin right there, and it's actually still preserved today. And if you can just try to imagine a family of 5 trying to live in a room that small, it's really incredible to see where he came from. His family moved to southern Indiana in 1816. Lincoln's formal schooling was limited to 3 brief periods in local schools, as he had to work after school to support his family. In 1830, his family moved to Macon County in southern Illinois, and Lincoln got a job working on a river flatboat hauling freight down the Mississippi River to New Orleans. After settling in a town of New Salem, Illinois, where he worked as a shopkeeper and a postmaster, Lincoln became involved in local politics as a supporter of the Whig Party, and he won election to the Illinois state legislature in 1834 at 23 years old. So really, what a rise from this one-room shack that he was born in all the way up to a member of the Illinois state legislature at 23 years old. Quite a fast rise for Abraham Lincoln during his life. Number 12, Lincoln taught himself law and found his future in Springfield, Illinois. Lincoln taught himself the law, passing the bar examination in 1836. The following year, he moved to the new state capital of Springfield, Illinois. For the next few years, he worked there as a lawyer and served clients ranging from individual residents of small towns to national railroad lines. By the mid-1850s, Lincoln had become one of the most highly respected and successful trial lawyers in the state. In Springfield, he met Mary Todd, a well-to-do Kentucky belle with many suitors, including Lincoln's future political rival, Stephen Douglas. and they married in 1842 after a long courtship. The Lincolns went on to have 4 children together, though only one would live into adulthood. As we mentioned, that was Robert Todd Lincoln. Edward Baker Lincoln and William Wallace Lincoln and Thomas Tad Lincoln were the other 3 boys, but all passed away in their youth. Number 13, Lincoln was an animal advocate and became a vegetarian. Lincoln was known for being compassionate towards animals and avoiding hunting. As a child, he shot a turkey and was so disgusted that he claimed he would never kill an animal again. He also wrote an essay in school criticizing his classmates for harming turtles and would scold his friends for putting hot rocks on their shells. He had a lifelong interest in protecting animals from cruelty, and the Lincoln White House became a sanctuary for many animals, including cats, dogs, goats, rabbits, and horses. At one point, there were as many as 18 cats in the White House during his tenure. When Mary asked what was Abraham's hobby, she answered, cats. He also became a full vegetarian in his adulthood. He also started the tradition of pardoning the turkey at the White House every year when his son wanted the turkey in 1861 to be spared. You can see a picture of his dog Fido there on the top, and then a picture of him pardoning the first turkey that was pardoned and his son at his side. And then you can see a meme there of Lincoln being the cat lover that he was, and he would bring lots of stray cats home. Number 14, Lincoln was in a duel like his predecessors. As we know, many of his predecessors had been in different types of duels. A young Abraham Lincoln publicly chastised James Shields in the course of a debate about banking in Illinois. See a picture there of Shields in the middle there. The ridicule pushed Shields to challenge Lincoln to a duel in which the victor took both the life and the pride of his opponent. It would be held in Missouri, where dueling was still legal. Since Lincoln was challenged by Shields, he had the privilege of choosing the weapon of the duel. He chose cavalry broadswords of the largest size. I didn't want the fellow to kill me, at which I thought I would have done if he selected pistols. At 6'4" inches tall, Lincoln planned to use his height to his advantage against Shields, who stood a mere 5'9" inches tall. The day of the duel, September 22, 1842, arrived, and the combatants met at Bloody Island, Missouri, to face death or victory. As the 2 men faced each other with a plank between them that neither was allowed to cross, Lincoln swung his sword high above Shields to cut down a nearby tree branch. This act demonstrated the immensity of Lincoln's reach and strength and was enough to show Shields that he was at a fatal disadvantage. With the encouragement of bystanders, these 2 men called a truce, and the duel was off. So you can see how Lincoln got himself out of this one by kind of slanting the rules towards his advantage. Number 15, some believe John Wilkes Booth did not die until many years later after the Lincoln assassination. See a picture there of after he shot Lincoln, he jumped off of the balcony onto the stage, and he actually broke his leg. You see a picture on the bottom right there of what the reward posters looked like all over the Washington, D.C. area, $100,000 reward for the murderer. 12 days after Lincoln's assassination, John Wilkes Booth was shot and killed by soldiers at a farm in Virginia, and his body was taken to New York for autopsy and identification. Booth was a famous actor, and his body was easily recognized. At least that was the official news that was given at the time. But soon after his death, conspiracy theories started beginning to circulate, claiming Booth didn't die, but had escaped and lived for years operating under an alias, David E. George. The first federal investigation opened in 1908, and the first documents on Booth came out in the 1920s. A Missouri man wrote to the Bureau claiming that Booth was his next-door neighbor. Nothing came out of those allegations, but the FBI continued to investigate Booth's life twice more, in 1948 and 1977, at the behest of the National Park Service. In the 1948 case, they examined the boot that Booth wore during his initial escape. There was writing on the inside of the boot, but the FBI couldn't decipher it. In 1977, the FBI examined Booth's diary for secret or invisible writings and found this statement: "Our country owed all her troubles to him, Lincoln, and God simply made me the instrument of his punishment. I have too great a soul to die like a criminal. Spare me that and let me die bravely." So very interesting that the FBI and the Federals kept investigating this murder situation over and over and trying to determine more facts around this very strange occurrence and whether it was truly Booth that died or not. Number 16, Lincoln tried to find generals to fight for victory. From 1861, beginning of the Civil War, until Gettysburg in 1863, and even afterwards, Lincoln was consistently disappointed with his generals and their army's performance, and they lost over and over to General Robert E. Lee and the Confederates. He regularly replaced battlefield commanders as he searched for a commander of all the Union armies who could deliver victory so the Union could be preserved. Struggling to find the right general to lead the army, Lincoln hoped that 1862 would bring a victorious end to the war. By spreading responsibility to a new general-in-chief, Henry Halleck, and the commanders of several armies, Meade, McClellan, and Pope, he encouraged them to cooperate, advance, and win. In the end, he relieved all of them of their commands. It wasn't until he found Ulysses S. Grant towards the end of the war that he found his general to win. And you can see Halleck's picture there on the top right. And then below him was McClellan, who he relieved of duty. And matter of fact, McClellan ran against him in 1864 for re-election. Below him, there's a picture of Pope. And then below him, a picture of Meade. And all four of those generals had command at one point or the other and then were relieved. And then, of course, there's a picture in the hat of Ulysses S. Grant, who took over in 1864 for the rest of the war. And then there's a picture, of course, of Robert E. Lee on the Confederate side. Number 17, Lincoln appears on the penny. In honor of President Abraham Lincoln's birth centennial, the Lincoln penny was produced and issued in 1909, designed by Victor David Brenner. It was the first coin that presented a portrait and the first that included a motto, "In God We Trust." On the reverse side, two wheat heads flank the denomination and the words United States of America, while atop sits the Latin phrase E pluribus unum, which translates as one out of many. For no particular reason, the Lincoln portrait is the only presidential portrait that faces to the right on a coin. So that's a really interesting fact that he faces right and everybody else faces left. See a picture there on the bottom right is the penny today, or 2007, but recent penny. And then on the left is one of the very old pennies from the 1940s. Number 18, Lincoln also appears on the $5 bill. Before Abraham Lincoln's portrait first debuted on the $5 bill in 1914, 7 other men secured a transitory spot on that denomination, ranging from Alexander Hamilton, from James Garfield. Starting in 1928, Lincoln had been on the face of the bill, which features the Lincoln Memorial on the reverse side. The bill's most current image of Lincoln is based on Matthew Brady's portrait of the president in 1864. In 2008, the $5 bill debuted its new high-tech redesign. Its new front includes the use of the color purple, an imprint of the Great Seal of the United States to the right of Lincoln's face, and a band of stars. On the back, the bold purple 5 watermark at the bottom right stands most conspicuously, along with the sprinkle of yellow 5s to the top right among many of its security measures. And you can imagine these are the types of measures you have to do to make sure things don't get counterfeit. On the top left up there is what the original $5 bill looked like in 1928 with Lincoln on it. Number 19, Lincoln was the first Republican president. As president, he built the Republican Party into a strong national organization from a fledgling party. Lincoln staunchly believed that secession by Southern states was illegal and built the Republican Party's platform around freeing the slaves from all states. On January 1st, 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation that declared forever free those slaves within the Confederacy. Lincoln never let the world forget that the Civil War involved an even larger issue, which was the right of all men and women to be free, as they were created equal under God. This he stated most movingly in dedicating the military cemetery at Gettysburg, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Lincoln won re-election in 1864 as Union military triumphs heralded an end to the war. In his planning for peace, the president was flexible and generous, encouraging Southerners to lay down their arms and join speedily in reunion. You see a very famous picture that was taken of him there. Number 20, Lincoln-Douglas debates catapulted Abe into the national spotlight. We mentioned this a little bit earlier in the program, and also was shown in the actual video how important these debates were. And there's some great pictures there on the bottom of Lincoln and Douglas doing their debating in front of thousands of people. And then a map of Illinois. And these were the 9 debates that took place during that campaign for the Senate. Those are all the places and stops that they made around the state of Illinois. So Lincoln was well-known as the most prominent lawyer in Illinois and had served as a congressman from Illinois and Washington, but he was not nationally known. The Lincoln-Douglas debates were a series of 7 debates in 1858 between Abraham Lincoln, the Republican Party candidate for the United States Senate from Illinois, and the incumbent Senator Stephen Douglas, the Democratic Party candidate. Until the 17th Amendment to the United States Constitution in 1913, which provides that senators shall be elected by the people of their states. Senators were elected by their respective state legislatures. So Lincoln and Douglas were trying to win the votes of the Illinois General Assembly for their respective parties. For Lincoln, they were an opportunity to raise both his national profile and that of the burgeoning Republican Party, while Douglas sought to defend his record, especially his leading role in promoting the doctrine of popular sovereignty and its incarnation in the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which allowed new states to choose whether they wanted to be slave states or not. The candidates spoke in each of Illinois' 9 congressional districts. So you can imagine how amazing these debates must have been to attend. How I would have loved to be there and be able to participate in at least one of them and listen to what they were talking about. Number 21, Lincoln is enshrined at the Wrestling Hall of Fame. We mentioned this briefly earlier. Abraham Lincoln wasn't quite WWE material, but thanks to his long limbs, he was an accomplished wrestler as a young man, defeated only once in approximately 300 matches. Lincoln reportedly talked a little smack in the ring. According to Carl Sandburg's biography of Lincoln, Honest Abe once challenged an entire crowd of onlookers after dispatching an opponent. And he said, "I'm the big buck of this lick. If any of you want to try it, come on and wet your horns." There were no takers. Lincoln's grappling exploits earned him an outstanding American honor in the National Wrestling Hall of Fame. See some great pictures there of Honest Abe back then taking on his wrestling opponents at the county fair and other locations. Number 22, the election of 1860 was controversial, primarily over the issue of slavery. While the platforms of the various parties competed for the presidency in 1860, they discussed issues such as national tariffs, the Homestead Act, and Transcontinental Railroad. The main issue dominating the campaign was slavery. The Democratic Party split over the issue of slavery. Northern Democrats believed in popular sovereignty, similar to Mr. Stephen Douglas, and the right of new states and territories to decide if they wanted to be slave states or not. Southern Democrats endorsed a federal slave code, which would guarantee the right of people to own slaves in any states that they wanted to. The Republican Party and Abraham Lincoln were morally opposed to slavery. If slavery is not wrong, nothing is, Lincoln said. And the party pledged to keep slavery out of the territories, but leave it untouched where it already existed in the South. The Constitutional Union Party took very few positions on anything, desperate to keep the country from tearing apart. You see all the different candidates there. You have Lincoln on the left, Stephen Douglas to his right, John Breckinridge to his right, and then John Bell on the very far right. Of course, John Bell was the Constitutional Union Party. And you see what the vote came in as: Abraham Lincoln at 40, Stephen Douglas 29, Breckinridge 18, John Bell 13. And of course, Abraham was elected. Number 23, Lincoln created the Secret Service hours before his assassination. On April 14, 1865, Lincoln signed legislation creating the U.S. Secret Service. That evening, he was shot at Ford's Theater. If the Secret Service had been established earlier, it would not have saved Lincoln. The original mission of the law enforcement agency was to combat widespread currency counterfeiting. It was not until 1901, after the killing of 2 other presidents, and we mentioned those earlier, that the Secret Service was formally assigned to protect the commander-in-chief. And you see a picture there on the top left. That was the first group of Secret Service men who were assigned at the time to go after counterfeiters. And then on the top right, of course, another picture of the assassination itself. So pretty ironic that he established the Secret Service on the day that he was killed, and that it actually didn't take the protection role until many years later. Number 24, John Wilkes Booth's brother saved the life of Lincoln's son. A few months before John Wilkes Booth assassinated Lincoln, the president's eldest son, Robert Todd Lincoln, stood on a train platform in Jersey City, New Jersey. A throng of passengers began to press the young man backwards, and he fell into an open space between the platform and a moving train. Suddenly, a hand reached out and pulled the president's son to safety by the coat collar. Robert Todd Lincoln immediately recognized his rescuer, famous actor Edwin Booth, who was the brother of John Wilkes Booth. In another eerie coincidence, on the day Edwin Booth's funeral, June 9th of 1893, this is many years later, Ford's Theater collapsed, killing 22 people. Pretty amazing, all these different coincidences. You can see Edwin Booth there on the left. That was John Wilkes Booth's brother. In the middle is Robert Todd Lincoln, who he saved. And then there's an interesting article there in the New York Times talking about Robert Lincoln being saved by Edwin Booth. Number 25, Lincoln came under enemy fire on a Civil War battlefield. When Confederate troops attacked Washington, D.C. in July 1864, Lincoln visited the front lines at Fort Stevens on 2 days of the battle, which the Union ultimately won. At one point, the gunfire came dangerously close to the president. Legend has it that Colonel Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr., a future Supreme Court justice, barked, "Get down, you fool!" Lincoln ducked down from the fort's parapet and left the battlefield unharmed. But he was prone to do this. This wasn't the first time either in the war that he had gone out to the front and tried to see the action for himself. This was the closest he came to actually getting shot, but there were several other times that he wanted to be out there. He wanted to be with the men. He wanted to be with the generals. He wanted to be close to the action, and he wanted to be seeing what's going on. And this is the one time that he really came close to being shot. The Gettysburg Address is the most famous in American history. We saw this in the video talking about this important address. Lincoln's famous Gettysburg Address was not originally called the Gettysburg Address, but actually an address to the fallen at the newly hallowed ground. The address was very short but impactful. Gettysburg as a battle became more famous than all the others, largely because Lincoln chose to travel there by train and address the nation with those famous 275 words. He spent time during his train journey to Gettysburg with other politicians who traveled with him or met him en route, and he wrote the address with feedback from his traveling party. Although he had a very high voice, and many Easterners considered his Kentucky accent odd, if not abrasive, Lincoln was also careful about his delivery. He often practiced his timing by reading aloud long speeches from Shakespeare, one of his favorite authors. So you can just imagine him. He would write these addresses very carefully, and then he would practice them over and over before he delivered them. And he would do that largely because, as it says here, he had the reputation of having a little bit of a squeaky voice, a high voice, and kind of an annoying voice. And of course, many Eastern or Northerners didn't like his Kentucky accent, but he was able to overcome all of that because his words were so powerful and so well crafted, and his speeches were so impactful that he just had the kind of impact he wanted on the country with these types of speeches. Of course, this one was over the top, the biggest of all of them, the Gettysburg Address, and there's a picture there of the address itself on the bottom right, the 275 words, and then several pictures of him actually delivering the address that day in Gettysburg. Some famous Abraham Lincoln quotes. "This country with its institutions belongs to the people who inhabit it. Human action can be modified to some extent, but human nature cannot be changed. Whenever I hear anyone arguing for slavery, I feel a strong impulse to see it tried on him personally. You can tell the greatness of a man by what makes him angry. I leave you hoping that the lamp of liberty will burn in your bosoms until there shall no longer be a doubt that all men are created free and equal. I'm a success today because I had a friend who believed in me and I didn't have the heart to let him down. I walk slowly, but I never walk backward. The best thing about the future is that it comes one day at a time. We, the people, are the rightful masters of both Congress and the courts, not to overthrow the Constitution, but to overthrow the men who pervert the Constitution. Better to remain silent and be thought a fool than to speak out and remove all doubt. I love that quote. And then finally, from the Gettysburg Address, 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. So some really fantastic quotes from Lincoln, and I could have put many more in here. He just had a lot of fantastic and memorable quotes throughout his career. So hopefully you enjoyed that, learning a lot of interesting facts about Lincoln maybe you didn't know, and maybe it's going to make you want to dig into him a lot more. He really is a fascinating character in our history. He was the leader we needed at the time. As he said in the video, and as I kind of agree, he had at least equal a challenge to George Washington, and maybe even a harder one, because the country was much larger when he took it over. It was much more divided. The weapons of the two armies were much more powerful. The politics was very brutal. The press was incredibly brutal at that time on him and on his administration, and really from both sides, trying to figure out what the country wanted to be. And so this really was the time that we needed to bring the country back together, or we were going to split apart. It really was kind of touch and go there for a while. So hopefully you enjoyed that. You learned a lot about him. We're going to go ahead and close the program tonight by listening to the Gettysburg Address being rendered and all the different words. We'll come back on the back side of that, and then we'll close out the program.
Fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note, nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us the living rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
So you can see there, he was really honoring the men that had died at Gettysburg and the sacrifices they had made, really on both sides. And he was very reverent, and he was very respectful and honorable towards the sacrifice that had been made that day. And if you haven't seen our episode on the Gettysburg battle, you should check it out. It really is quite remarkable, all the things that happened in those 3 days and how it changed the course of our history. And this speech was really an eloquent summation of what happened and the honorable things that happened there to try to preserve the Union, to try to recognize that the country was founded under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all, and that all men are created equal. So he really was trying to be as inspiring as he could towards the country so that we could pull the country back together and be one nation. So anyway, thank you very much for tuning in this evening. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel. We have many great programs coming your way. And thank you very much for being a fan of history like we are here at Traveling Through History. And we will definitely see you next time. Have a great evening.